Welcome back to Chinese 270, China and the West. Where had we left off last week? Well, we had of course discussed the concept of Jesuit accommodation. And we had said that in the context of the Jesuits' mission in China, the process of the intellectual fusion of Confucianism and Catholicism was called accommodation. And we sort of had started to talk about some of the challenges that came with that, right? We had said that this process of accommodation essentially caused them, the Jesuits, but also in some cases the Chinese, to make difficult choices about what to accept and what to reject, right? So if the Jesuits accepted elements of Chinese culture that contradicted the Christian faith, accommodation would become theologically invalid. If, on the other hand, they did not accept certain essential elements in Chinese culture, then the Chinese would reject it, right? And we had said that this process of accommodation was really something that the Jesuits practiced all over the world. And then, of course, we had discussed that Matteo Ricci and other Jesuits had realized that only by mastering Confucian classics, right, that those fundamental texts that especially the ruling literati elite had to master, would they be able to gain access to precisely that literati elite, the country's elite class, the mandarins, right, high-ranking government officials who had passed the various civil service exams. And as a reminder, here on the right is a mandarin. Now, and of course, for your homework, you had looked at examples of some of the most prominent Chinese converts to Christianity, namely Xu Guangqi and Li Zhizao. And of course, we also had looked at some Confucian texts, right? We had looked at the three-character classic, the Sanzijiang, which, right, we had said was really a distillation of Confucian learning for children who really had just started their schooling, and in these sort of couplets consisting of three characters each, essentially distilled what was really the essence then of Confucianism. And we had said, and I think your study of the Sanzijing over the last week will have made you realize that this was really an emphasis on the importance of learning and studying, and how that had an impact on self-refinement that would ultimately lead to the attainment of a state that in Confucianism is usually referred to as junzi. In English, it's sort of a little difficult to translate. Sometimes it's translated as a Confucian gentleman, because this idea that, a gentleman in English, right, in England, in sort of Victorian England, this idea that a gentleman always did what was right and sort of knew what was right almost intuitively. But of course, what is interesting is that Confucianism is not so much about intuitive behavior. It's things that you can learn, right? That you can master by studying. So it actually gives agency to the student. So sometimes then it's translated as a man of complete virtue, which is probably a better translation because it somewhat captures this agency, right? There is emphasis on rituals, very important, Li, and rituals are really core principles of Confucianism, so much as that, I mentioned already last week that Confucianism in Chinese is not really called Confucianism, it's sometimes just called Li Jiao, which means the study of rites. So, rituals and rites are really at the heart of what we call Confucianism. And the observance of these rites then really provides societal stability and a standard of conduct. And then there is an emphasis on the observance of cardinal relationships, very important. There were actually 5, especially relationship between ruler and ruled, members of a household, man and wife, and his children and friends. And there is an emphasis on Confucian morality, especially filial piety. That is how you are supposed to behave as a child towards your elders. And then, of course, there is emphasis on benevolence and righteousness. A word about that in a second. Now, the Sanzi-jing, I said, was really the first formal textbook. And as such, it was also really just an introduction to the most common written Chinese characters that you kind of had to master early on, grammatical structures, and just basic elements of Chinese history and culture. We, of course, also had looked at some real Confucian classics, right? Those Confucian classics that were really the basis of the civil service exams. And I think we sort of had teased out, again, this idea of virtue and attaining complete virtue by way of studying, by way of self-refinement, and, of course, these core virtues of benevolence and righteousness. Now, we will return to the significance of Confucianism, and especially the significance of Jesuit translations of Confucian texts in a few weeks, when we discuss the European reception of China and Chinese culture in the 17th century. And we will see that these Confucian texts actually had a profound impact on the way Europeans in the 17th and 18th century thought of China. And these translations done by the Jesuits played a pivotal role. So stay tuned for that in a couple of weeks. Now, again, let me emphasize that when the Jesuits first arrived in China, they first tried a different strategy. They saw Buddhists, wearing Buddhist robes. They realized that Buddhism was, an important religion, and they at first tried to befriend the Buddhist clergy. But then they soon realized that the country was really run by the mandarins, this literati class, this Confucian elite, which was really not a religious elite, right? It was really a class that had mastered the state philosophy of Confucianism, which again is not really a religion, even though, sometimes in folk religion there are also elements of Confucianism. But really, Confucianism at its core does not concern itself with, the afterlife and hell and heaven and these things. It does concern itself a little bit with ancestor worship, but that, in a way, really just fits into this idea of filial piety. Now, the Jesuits themselves impressed these literati elites by way of their own erudition and their scientific abilities, especially in the fields of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and cartography. And you remember last week I read you that little snippet from a Chinese intellectual who had met Matteo Ricci and who was just so impressed by his ability to converse in Chinese and just, his well-roundedness as an intellectual, a member of the literati almost. What we in Europe probably would call a Renaissance man. In Chinese they probably would have called him a junzi. And of course, again, for your homework, you looked at some of the most prominent examples, right, of Chinese converts to Christianity, Xu Guangqi and Li Zhizao. Now, this respect, and this is really important, this respect for cultural and scientific accomplishments really went both ways, right? So the Chinese were impressed by the Jesuits, but we have to remember that the Jesuits were just as impressed by Chinese civilization, Chinese cultural, intellectual, and scientific accomplishments. And one example of that is actually printing and books and learning, and the way learning was preserved and passed on in China. So Matteo Ricci and other Jesuits were really impressed by the level of learning and literacy in China, and they often marveled at the ready availability of books. in Europe in the 16th and 17th century, books were still incredibly expensive, even though they had become much more available and also cheaper than, say, during medieval times, right? You remember we talked about the invention of the printing press in Europe for the Europeans. But still, no comparison to the availability and just the sheer volume of books in China. So Ricci reported that around 1600, I quote, the vast number of books in circulation in China and the ridiculously low prices at which they are sold. One publisher was producing 600 titles with 100,000 wooden printing blocks. So what that means, a printing block in China, I said they already had movable type, but because of the use of Chinese characters, it wasn't actually that practical. And what they usually would do is they would actually just carve an entire page into a printing block, and they would then sort of print it, they would print it by page. Well, they would do the same in Europe, of course, with movable type, but in China, they would carve that entire page into one block. Now, cheap and low quality books were produced at various places throughout China, and generally books were printed. I don't know if you've seen a Chinese book. They were printed on one side of thin paper, and then the paper would be folded, and then it would be bound on one side, and then you still had a front and a back, but actually you would really only print on that one side. And here it's kind of interesting. We have a scientific depiction, probably from a Chinese encyclopedia, of how paper was made, right? Harvest bamboo poles, trim the leaves, then soak in water, boil up the bamboo stems with lime over a fire, sieve the pulp onto mash frames, press the paper on stacked frames to squeeze out the water, dry the paper on the wall of a heated chamber. Now, this mutual respect then led to an unequaled example of cross-cultural collaboration, and that was the 坤舆萬國全圖, or Map of the Myriad Countries of the Earth of 1602. Now, what is that? Well, it was a woodblock print consisting of 6 panels of fine bamboo fiber paper, right? We just saw the making of that on those prints. Each panel measuring 2 feet by 5.75. And Matteo Ricci had worked on this project with the mathematician whom we already know, right, Li Zhizao, and a number of other European Jesuits and Chinese collaborators. And this was a map, right? It was a map of the world, essentially, presented to the imperial household. And it soon became highly sought after, and many pirated copies are believed to have been in circulation because this was printed, right? They had produced printing blocks of this. The people think that this printing press with which the Jesuits made this, people would just use it at night to make unofficial copies. And if it looked familiar to you, of course, you are right. Here we have it, a different version in color, and it is, of course, that very familiar opening slide for our course. So it is a map of the world done by Matteo Ricci in China in 1602. Now, today only 6 original copies of the map are known to exist, and only 2 are in really good condition. One is at the Vatican in Rome, and one, lo and behold, at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. So if you ever pass through the Twin Cities, make sure to stop and have a look at that map. Now, various versions of the map were exported to Korea and later on to Japan, and the one in color is actually a Japanese version. But the one that we're looking here, the non-color one, is the one at the University of Minnesota, and it's nice because it shows you the way it is mounted on these 6 panels. And here it is a little bigger without any writing. And here it is with somebody right in front to show you the scale of the map, which is really phenomenally impressive. Now, and you will have guessed right, this map, of course, is going to be the object of our second course stream, and we will look at it in a little bit more detail. And the questions I want us to bear in mind as we plunge into the map are these. In what way would the map and its authorized and unauthorized reproductions have impacted Jesuit accommodation? In what way might it have helped shape the image of the West and China's place in the world? How was China, Europe, and the rest of the world actually depicted on this map? How does this relate to this term of sinocentrism that we already talked about? Wow, a lot to explore in our second course stream, and I will see you shortly.